You have 1, 2, 3, 4 i's. If you have 4 i's multiplied together, that's just 1. So what's left over is I. Answer should be C. On this one you have 2, 5, 7. You have I to the 7th, but remember that I to the 6th is negative 1. If that's a negative 1, negative 1 times I is negative I. Look, you have a I to the 4th there, and an I to the 4th there. They're both 1s. Answer is B. For this one, you have I to the 9th. I to the 8th is 1. If that's 1, then you just have I left over, so the answer is A. Pick a number from 1 to 20 and drop it off. The winning numbers today should be 2, 4, 8, 11, and 14. Homework check. Bring it up here and show me what you have. We had 2 out of 9, which is 22%. The homework answers. Number 1 is 6i. 2 is negative 72i. 3 is I. 4 is a negative 1/9. And 5 is a negative 2. Number 6 is negative 3. 7 is 3. 8 is 2/3. 9 is I over 6. 10 is 1 over 2i. And 11 is 8. And 12 is negative 81. 13 is negative 18i. 14 is negative 12i, or not 12i, but just negative 12. And 15 is a negative 1/5. To simplify complex numbers, example 1. You have an I plus 1 over I. And the reason we have to simplify this is because there's an I on the bottom. Just like we did yesterday, you're going to have to multiply the top and the bottom by something to help simplify this. What am I going to multiply the top and the bottom by? I over I. So if I multiply by I over I, you're distributing this I to that first I to get an I squared. And then to the 1 times I is just I. On the bottom, I times I is I squared. What can I simplify now with that new fraction? I squared, yeah, we have an I squared here on the top, which is a negative 1. And then on the bottom, we have an I squared, negative 1. Now, what else can I simplify? There's something in there that should not be. Yeah, you have a negative on the bottom, so change the sign of everything in there. Make it 1 minus I over 1. What is still in this expression that's not supposed to be there? Yeah, it's over 1. You never leave anything over 1, so it's 1 minus I for the final answer. And your final answers have to be in a certain form. The general form of a complex number is A plus BI. So if you have a final answer that has a constant and an imaginary number, put the constant first and then the imaginary number second, just like we did here. We started with this, and in order to simplify, we multiplied the top and the bottom by I so we could make this an I squared. And what you do to the bottom, you do to the top. I times I is I squared. 1 times I is I. We simplified the I squares to negative 1s. Then we changed the sign of everything because of this, and we took away the 1 on the bottom to get 1 minus I. Example 2. 2I minus 3 over I. What do I multiply the top and the bottom by to simplify? Yeah, we multiply by I on the top and the bottom. And on top, 2I times I is 2I squared. And I times the minus 3 is minus 3I. On the bottom, you have I squared. So again, we can simplify our I squares and make them negative 1s. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. And then I have that negative 1 on the bottom. So I have to change the sign of everything and then drop that 1 from the bottom. So I would have 2 plus 3I, and the 1 that's on the bottom would go away. 2 plus 3I is the answer. On this problem, we're going to multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 4I minus I squared over I squared. 4I minus a negative 1 over negative 1. That's a double negative on top, so that's plus. But you must change the sign of everything now because of this. It's a negative 4I minus 1, and with the 1 down there dropping. However, remember you have to put it in the right form. So it's a negative 1 minus 4I. When you get to this point in the problem and you change the sign of everything, you have negative 4I minus 1. To put it in the right form, all you do is shuffle the terms and the signs in front of them. So it would be a negative 1 minus 4I. On the bonus, you have 3 i's. So it's 2I to the third. I to the third is really a negative I. So it's just negative 2I for the answer. On the practice problem, let's multiply the top and the bottom by I to come up with 3I to the third minus 2I squared over I squared. Simplify what you can. I to the third is negative I. That's a negative 1, and that's a negative 1. So if this I to the third is a negative I, that would give you a negative 3I in that spot. Negative 1 times the negative 2 would be plus 2. And then on the bottom you have negative 1. So change the sign of everything. That should be a minus 2. The 1 on the bottom drops out, but put it in the right form. So minus 2 plus 3I is the answer. Let's say we had 2I squared minus 3I and all of that over I. What I would have to do is multiply the top and the bottom by I, because that would make this I squared. So we can get an I off of the bottom. But then multiply the top by I. 2I squared times I is 2I to the third. You just add the exponents together. That's a 1 exponent. And then minus 3I times I would be minus 3I squared. And go back and simplify these i's to make it easier to work with. I to the third is negative I. That's on your list. So negative I times 2 is a negative 2I. And if I squared is a negative 1, it becomes a double negative with the 3. So you end up with plus 3. From this right here, it's negative 3 times negative 1. That's why we get plus 3. And then on the bottom, a negative 1. So that negative 1 on the bottom makes you change the signs on the top, and it just drops out. But you have to write your final answer with the minus 3 first and then the plus 2i second. So on this problem, I'm going to multiply by I, top and bottom, to get rid of the I on the bottom. It'll make it I squared. That's what we want to do. Now what do I get if I multiply I by 5i to the third? What's I to the third times I? I to the fourth. Yeah, you have a 3 and then a I to the first. So you add the exponents. And the 5 stays along, so it would be 5i to the fourth. And then you multiply the I just marked over it, but you multiply the I by minus 2i squared. And I squared is, or I squared times I is I to the third. So it would be minus 2i to the third. Just basic rules of exponents. If I had I squared and I squared, multiply them together, I get I to the fourth. You just add the exponents. You have to simplify this. What's I to the fourth? 1. So if it's 1, I just have a 5 there now. And what is I to the third? Negative I. So let's break that one apart here. We have negative 2 times negative I. I to the third is negative I. So a double negative makes it plus. And then you would have 2i. On the bottom, that I squared is negative 1. So change the sign of everything on top. And it's gone. Your final answer is already in the right form. So that's it. Try this one and bring it up. On the practice problem, I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by I and come up with 10i to the third minus 2i squared over I squared. I to the third is negative I, so that gives me a negative 10i. And that's a minus 2i squared here. I squared is negative 1 times the negative 2 is plus 2. And then you have this negative 1 on the bottom. Change the sign of everything. This drops out, but then reverse it to put it in the right form. Negative 2 plus 10i. Try this problem and bring it up. This one is 8i to the third minus 2i over I. On this practice problem, I would multiply the top and the bottom by I to get 8i to the fourth minus 2i squared over I squared. I to the fourth here is going to be 1, so I'm just left with an 8. And I squared is negative 1 times the negative 2 is plus 2. On the bottom, I have negative 1. 8 plus 2 is 10 over negative 1 is just negative 10. Alright, the problem is 8i to the third minus 5i squared over I. Another way you can do this other than multiplying the top and bottom by I, this only works when you have i's here, here, and here. That's the only way it will work. And usually when these exponents are larger than the one on the bottom. If that's the case, then I to the third over I. If I divide I to the third by I get I to the second. And if I divide I to the second by I get just I. I subtract the exponents. 3 minus 1 is 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. And then from there, I squared is a negative 1, so I have a negative 8 minus 5i. This practice problem is 12i squared minus 6i over I. On this problem, since I have an I here, here, and here, I can divide the top by I to come up with 12i minus 6, but I have to reverse that to put it in the right order. Negative 6 plus 12i. On the bonus, you have 1, 3 is 4, 5, 7. I to the 7th. Remember, I to the 6th is negative 1. So that would be a negative I. This is a bonus problem. 5 times 10 is 50. I, and I is I to the 3rd. I to the 3rd is negative I. 50 times negative I is negative 50I. This is a bonus problem. We'll have 6, 10, 13. So we'll have I to the 13th. Remember that since I to the 4th is 1, so is I to the 8th and I to the 12th. I would have to multiply by an I to get I to the 13th there. So that would be 1 times I, which is just I. On the bonus problem, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 I's. So it's going to be 1, but you have 2 times 3, which is 6. On this, you have 2, and 3 makes 5. 4 is 9, and 5 is 14. So that's I to the 14th power. And remember that I to the 4th was 1, so I to the 8th is 1. I to the 12th is 1, and you need an I to the 2nd. You figured it out?
Times those top ones like they were...
Oh. You multiplied the 2, 3, 4, and 5. Alright, so if this one is 1, I squared is just negative 1.